Matthew, yes. Come on.
God, thank you so much for gathering us here today just to learn more about your word and just know about more of your character and just who you are to us. And we just pray for Sean during this time, Lord, that you would just speak so clearly to him, that your words would just flow right through him and to us, and that we would just gain a greater revelation of who you are, and that we would just become a people who are just so faithful and just so obedient to your word, and people that your word would just so come alive in us, and it would just emanate and radiate out of us, that we would be a people that would just love your truth and defend it and just love it so much that we would that we would just want other people to know about it. Thank you so much for this time. Amen.
Thanks, Matthew. All right, so we have spent the last 2 days just walking through the book of Joshua. And I hope that you really enjoyed our journey through the book, the keys for success we had from that generation. In particular, I hope you enjoyed a sense of optimism that we were able to have. All right, that's what we started out on Monday. I said, I want you to be optimistic about what God can do in your generation because of what's going on in our world oftentimes. Thank you, sir. Oftentimes, we're not optimistic. We don't have faith that God can really do something in our day and age. That the 1040 window, that, again, all the Middle East could come to Christ. Now we realize it's come back to Christ. The gospel's already been through that area and it was pushed out. And as you read through the stories, they're all the great stories that we like to talk about in worship, and like when you're doing intercession, right? They're the great ones to quote, about walls falling down and God doing stuff. And so again, that was an enjoyable couple of days, and now we get to the book of Judges, right? And so some of you, maybe your personality are more like Joshua. You're the optimist. Love to give the rallying cries in intercession. For some of you, you may find that you appreciate the book of Judges more. And as we approach the book of Judges, what I want to encourage you with is that it's not supposed to make us pessimistic. It's not supposed to make us pessimistic, right? So you don't just read everything that happened in Joshua and go, well, what was the point of that? Right? Because it was only one generation. It was so short-lived. And as soon as we turn the page from, that last chapter of Joshua and we're getting into the first chapter of Judges, we don't have to go very far to start feeling more pessimistic. It's like we start reading Judges 1:1, and it's talking about how the conquest continued. And Judah is able to push the Canaanites out of certain territories. And for a few verses, we're able to be happy. Until chapter 1, verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, and then in verse 29, and Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out. 31, Asher did not drive out. Right? It keeps going. Naphtali did not drive out. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country. I mean, we didn't get to enjoy much success in this third generation that's come out of the Exodus, the time of the wilderness. And so, again, I think we could read through this, and particularly by the time we get to the last two stories, you ever, as you're reading through the last two stories, you're like, what's the timeless truth here? Where's the good example? What's the point of these two stories being in here? What I want to challenge you with is not to be pessimistic as you read through Judges and you think about our world, but what we do need to be is be realistic. We need to be realistic, and what that means is that we need to be prepared to face the kind of spiritual battle, the kind of idolatry, the kind of sinfulness that we're going to encounter when we take the gospel out, whether we're going back to the West or whether God is sending us on to Asia or Africa. You will face situations like we find in Judges. This is the sinful nature of man. These two pictures really kind of summarize it to me. Again, sorry, it's getting cut off there. That if Joshua's generation was about taking the land, Then the judges' generations, and we know there's many, it's about 300 years, is about becoming like the land. They do exactly what God told them not to do in Leviticus 18. Right? Leviticus 18, God is very specific. Do not become like the land. Don't do the things that they do, because if you do, I'm going to vomit you out. Just wonderful illustration there, God. Thank you very much. Right? Israel will become barf if they don't follow God's laws and God's commandments. And yet, that's exactly what we find. This picture on the side, you remember the other day I mentioned about Molech worship. It was one of the gods that they worshipped here in the area of Canaan. And how they worshiped the god was by sacrificing their newborn infant sons. And they would build these 30-foot statues. They would build up the fires underneath of it. And at kind of the height of that ceremony, they would place this baby into the statue's hands and then watch it burn alive. And this is the people of God that are doing these things. When we keep reading in Judges that they worship Baals and they worship Asherahs and they worship the gods of the land, this is what it looks like. And sometimes, if you come from the West, we don't always know what to do with these idolatry passages, because we feel like, oh, well, we don't have idols in our particular land anymore, and so we turn it into greed, or we turn it into being self-centered. I think we really are missing the point. There's still a lot of idols out there today. Right? And it's still this kind of gross worship. It talks about them worshiping the Baals, and that's an artist rendition of them worshiping Baal, who's the god of the storm. And of course, like I said, how do you worship Baal? Well, you have sex with the temple priestesses or prostitutes. You use menstrual blood. You use semen in your worship practices. You gash yourself and blood starts pouring out. You emasculate yourself. You understand that when you read through Leviticus and a lot of these laws that just sound weird. Like, why does God care whether somebody has crushed testicles or not? That's one of the laws. I mean, did you just kind of read through that really quickly and not stop and go, that's just mean, God. It's not his fault that he's got crushed testicles. Why don't you want him to serve as a priest? Right? And the point, or tattoos, that's another one. But the point there is that those were the things that they did to themselves to worship their gods. If you were a man and you wanted to worship a female goddess, you had to emasculate yourself. You had to literally crush your own testicles so that you could be in touch with your feminine side and worship Asherah. So you need to remember, as we're reading through Judges and they keep talking about worshiping the gods of the land, this is how they did it. This is what they became like. And I said, I would love it if our generations could be known as Joshua generations, as ones who changed, again, the flow of history, who cared about holiness, who had good leaders and all that. But the reality is, as things stand right now, I think the Western church, we will be known as a Judges generation. I think we usually do things like we throw up statistics. Sorry. No, don't freeze. There we go. We throw up statistics about the Western church. Statistics like these. For 20 to 33% of all Christian marriages will end in divorce. And maybe like 1 out of every 3. Now there was this huge study done recently because about 10 years ago they used to throw out the figures that it's like 1 out of every 2. And so then they redid all the studies, took new statistics, and they said, oh, no, it's not nearly that bad. That was just scare tactics. It's actually about 1 out of every 3 Christian marriages that end in divorce. So that's much better, right? 1 out of every 3 end in divorce. And it really is just barely lower than the non-Christian average. 1 out of 8 pastors will commit adultery, 1 out of every 4 Christian men. Now on this one I thought, that can't be right. Can't be 1 out of every 4 Christian men will commit adultery. So I went back, I checked with Barna, which is a statistics group, Christian statistics group. I checked magazine articles from Christianity Today. These are recent figures. I mean, this is accurate. 60% of young Christians think living together before marriage is okay. By living together, we're talking about cohabitation, which means we're talking about sex before marriage. So 60% of our young people think this. What's it going to be in 10 years? What's it going to be in 20 years? How high will the percentage be then when these young people are the pastors and the YWAM leaders of tomorrow? And letting people know this particular view. 1 out of every 3 young Christian men views pornography daily. Daily. I mean, I think, like I said, sometimes I think we're almost numb. Like, we'd have to have a ridiculous statistic to really shock us, because it's in the news all the time. I mean, what the Catholic Church has gone through, and I'm not a Catholic Church basher, I'm just saying this is realistic. This is in the news about Catholic priests abusing young children that are in their churches, and the Catholic Church is throwing out millions of dollars to try to settle most of these lawsuits out of court. So, abuse, greed, scandals, what really is at the heart of it? What is causing this slide? Because we want to know, we want to be able to stop it. At the end of the book of Judges, in chapter 17 and chapter 21, it throws out this repeated phrase. Okay, a repeated phrase that I believe is significant to us understanding the book of Judges and avoiding its problems. And this is what it says. Right? Chapter 17, verse 6, and in chapter 21, verse 25. It really is the last verse of the book. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel." Now, a lot of commentators, a lot of Bible scholars say that's the main point that the author is making. That the book of Judges is basically a defense of the Davidic dynasty, of David's kingship, the kingship in the south. And they're saying, this is what happens when you don't have good leadership. In this whole time period of the Judges, if they just had a king, they could have avoided all these problems. I don't think that that's the point at all. In fact, when we get into Samuel and the book of Kings, the kings themselves are like a last measure. They're like enforcers of God. They're brought in because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And the king wields the sword in order to force people back to God. So I think the second part is the key phrase that the author wanted to communicate. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And if we can try to think of a more accurate description of Western culture today, I can't think of one. Really? I mean, all you have to do, just go ahead. Don't pull up CNN right now because you're supposed to be paying attention to me. But after class, just pull up CNN.com or whatever. And again, as we said, look into gender issues, sexuality issues, morality issues, and everything is just being pushed and pushed and pushed. Why? Because everyone has the right to their own opinion. And we just need to be tolerant of those opinions. So what's right in your eyes may not be right in mine, but hey, I just love you. And you should have the right to be able to live your life however you want. Interesting to find that this worldview, this philosophical motto, is not new. Right? Ecclesiastes says there's really nothing new under the sun. Satan has the same strategies he's been using for thousands of years, and we keep falling for him. Right? Oh, we just call it moral relativity, and it sounds more intellectual. But really, it's just the same thing. We just like to do what we want to do. If it's good in our eyes, if we think it'll make us happy, hey, then again, whatever we need to do to achieve those goals is justifiable. And so this is the background of Judges. And if we are really going to serve our generation, if we're going to go out, particularly in the West, we need to be prepared to expect this. That no matter how wonderfully you present the gospel message, you can do it through song, you can do it through dance, you can have all your truth prepared. Remember I said the other day, Peter said, be ready to prepare to defend the hope that we have in Christ. And you can have that all thought through, you can know the Bible back and forth, and people will still reject the gospel because they want to do what they want to do. And they know that somehow the Bible is going to confront this particular lifestyle. The Bible is not going to allow you just to do whatever you want, whatever you think is right in your own eyes. It's going to act as a filter. It's going to act as a conviction. And so we need to be prepared to face this particular kind of battle. So what does this look like in our churches? What does this look like in a practical, everyday kind of situation? As I said, in Taiwan, my wife works with a school that was started to serve missionary children. It just celebrated its 60th anniversary. It was started by 4 different missions organizations that came into Taiwan shortly after Taiwan became a nation in 1949. And so their heart was that we want to help missionaries stay on the field. And because many of the missionary kids coming over did not know Chinese, or public school system was not letting them in, they said, we've got to do something. So in a little kind of hut, basically, they started, and they had about 12 children. And they said, we don't want to go the route of other international schools. We don't want to just be focused on academics. We want to have the gospel be our strong foundation. We want to send kids out on missions trips, doing community outreach and evangelism. And so they're very serious about that goal and that mission statement. Well, when we moved down to Taichung, my wife started working there about 4 years ago, I met one of the guys who was really pretty influential on the campus. He was in charge of a very serious department, and in addition to that, he also had started his own little home church fellowship. So every Sunday, he kind of gathered together a group of teachers, and a lot of the students were coming into that, and he was leading that church fellowship. He coached some of the sports teams. He was very involved in connecting the school to the community. And yet, when I met him, you know, sometimes you meet someone and you just have this feeling something is off. Something's just not right with this guy. I mean, the first thing I noticed is that he kept talking about all the rich people that he knew. Almost like kind of trying to impress me with, you know, all of his stories. Yeah, I was on this guy's boat last week, and we were just, you know, going off to Green Island. Oh, I was up at the Ruth Chris Steakhouse, $100 steak, you know. I mean, just those kinds of stories, and you think, okay, I mean, I'd be pretty excited if I got to eat a $100 steak, but I'm not sure if that's the conversation I would lead with for someone I just met. The other thing that he always used to talk about was alcohol. About, oh, he just found a new store in town that was selling this special kind of Irish beer that he loved, and hey, I should come up and we could hang out and let's have a beer next week. And somehow the conversation would come back to alcohol, and how he was pretty much an expert on every single location where you could get some, and even was excited because he had a buddy who was owner of a restaurant, and he was going to start bringing in a special kind of alcohol that he wanted. And you're like, that seems wrong. But what really got me was this attitude that he had, that he was better than most of the other Christians on campus. I don't know if you've ever met someone like that, but he basically, it wasn't a legalistic pride, it was the reverse. It was that most of these other Christians are the goody two-shoes Christians on campus. They're the ones who want to live back in the Amish days, or Little House on the Prairie. They don't watch TV. They don't use even Christian swear words. They don't drink. They don't dance, like all those kind of things. And he looked down on those kind of people. He felt like, he really understood the gospel, and he understood that, God doesn't care about drinking and alcohol, and these people aren't real. They'll never be able to interact with the kids. The kids can see through that fake kind of leave it to Beaver Christianity, and so I'm the one who will really be kind of cool and cutting edge. Well, last year, I remember my wife coming back from class, and she came up to me and she's like, "Did you hear what happened?" And I said, "No, I haven't heard anything. I'm just sitting here studying the Bible all day long. I have no idea what's going on in the outside world." Sometimes I feel like that. And so she comes up and she says, "We just found out that this guy has been involved in an extramarital affair for the last 4 years. And in fact, the guy found out about it because he was cheating with someone who was also married. So it was like double adultery case. And in Taiwan, if you are found cheating with someone's spouse, you can actually sue them. You can take them to court and sue them for a lot of money. Right? There's a nice kind of thing that should detract people from committing divorce. So what he had to do is he had to rush to meet with this guy and basically kind of beg him to do an out-of-court settlement. So that day he went to the bank, he emptied out all his bank account. So they had about $19,000 just in emergency funds. I mean, they're missionaries. And he'd been a missionary for 17 years. 17 years. So he clears out his bank accounts and gives all the money to this guy, but it's all out. It's all busted. The whole community knows about it. And he's got 2 kids. He's got one boy who's about 11 years old, and he has a daughter who is about 13. His wife is a teacher at the school, right next to my wife in her classroom. And the thing that I think really shocked me about it, unfortunately, it didn't shock me that somebody was having an adulterous affair. It doesn't anymore, because like I said, we look at these statistics, it just happens. It happens in YWAM. If you don't want to believe that, I am sad to state it happens in YWAM. I've had staff have adulterous affairs and then get divorced. And so what shocked me wasn't so much that it happened, it's that this guy never repented. Never. He was never sorry. He never apologized. He never stood up and said, hey, you know what, I'm really sorry because I have ruined our reputation into the community. Or, hey, I feel really horribly because I have totally ruined my kids' lives. Or, hey, I'm sorry because I have caused my wife to be just completely humiliated and hurt and in pain and wondering why he doesn't love her and doesn't choose her. Or, hey, how about I have defamed the name of Christ? Like, I am sorry because I was a church leader. I was a pastor. And what are all these young teenagers that I've coached and that have been in my church, what are they going to think? If this is what their pastor is living like, this is what a 17-year career missionary looks like, completely unrepentant sinner. And so he never did repent. About a day later, he moved out of his apartment with his family. He got his own apartment. He got a job in the community. And about 6 months later, moved off, got another job working for a company in another country. His wife and his kids had to kind of try to pick up their lives, and eventually she had to move back to the mainland because she just couldn't do it as a single parent. She couldn't keep teaching full time and do missions and take care of their kids. And of course, the son was having all kinds of problems at school because of what he was, working out in his life. And you see, when you look at that, then you understand where this is getting us to in Christianity. That when this is coming into Christianity now, that's the results. That's what it looks like. That's how all this work that has been done to build up the name of Christ in a community and a nation could just get torn down. Because this guy thinks he has the right. He thinks it's okay for him to have this extramarital affair. And so I want to challenge us with this book. This book basically gives us an idea of the opposite direction of Joshua. So Joshua, what does it look like when people obey God and follow His covenant and care about holiness? It looks like this. But if you say, okay, well, just for curiosity's sake, what would it look like if we did the exact opposite? If we blew off God and didn't meditate on His Word day and night and just kind of chose to do whatever we want, this is it. This is that ugly picture. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to do like I did with Joshua. I'm going to give you the big picture of the book. So we're going to take kind of a walk through the book, a walk through the structure. And my structure is very similar again to the one that you have in your Nelson handbook. The only one part kind of I disagree a bit, and we'll talk about that. And then why this book was put together, the key information, main idea, reason written, how it fits into the history as far as the dating and things of that nature. And then we'll start making our way through the book. And today we're going to start by looking at the people that God chooses to use in the book of Judges. It's very interesting characters in this story, and very interesting stories about what God did through them. And it's not boring. I'll say this about Judges. It's not a boring book. It might be X-rated if you made a Bible movie out of it and really tried to make it accurate. But it's, again, a very accurate picture of what was going on in Israel at that time. All right, the structure of the book, let's go ahead and open up to chapter 2. The structure of the book of Judges has a lot to do with this cycle that keeps happening over and over and over again. And what the author does is he gives us a preview of that cycle, a preview of what's going to happen in their history. So would someone please read chapter 2, verses 11 through 15 for us, please.
The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of people around them. And they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel. So he handed them over to raiders who stole their possessions. They turned them over to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned. The people were in great distress.
All right, thank you. All right, so we remember from the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy chapter 28, and in Leviticus chapter 26, that God was very clear with the people. He was very clear about what would happen if they obey and what would happen if they disobey, the blessings and the cursings. And he even gave each specific example, each specific detail of what judgment would look like. And one of those judgments would be that he would no longer give them victory over their enemies. That when they went out to battle, they would be defeated by their enemies and they would be sold into slavery. So really, if we just have this part of the cycle, and we see that they abandon the Baals, abandon God, they turn to Baals, God starts to discipline them, right? It could really just end there. That's all really God promised them would happen. And yet it goes on, the cycle. Would someone read verses 16 through about 18? Stereo.
Then the Lord raised up judges to rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors, who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people who were burdened by oppression and suffering.
All right, so when we read this, okay, so we have the sin. There's a generation, and either it says they don't know the Lord or they choose not to worship him. They turn to idols. God then brings covenant justice. He gives them into the hand of an oppressor, one of the smaller people groups around them, maybe the Moabites or the Ammonites or one of the Canaanite kings that are still in the land. And typically what happens in the story is then the people go, right? We call that 911 Christians. We don't care about God when everything is going well. When we can do what is right in our own eyes and get away with it, cha-ching, right? Still going to heaven and I'm a sinner. Great combination. But then suddenly we start to feel the consequences of our sinful actions. We end up in jail. We end up getting arrested. Our marriages start going into the trash can. You know, whatever are the consequences, not just of our sin, but even of the discipline of the Lord. And then we realize, oh, maybe we made a mistake here. Maybe we are in trouble. Maybe we're suffering. And then they cry out to the Lord. And the thing that I want us to be impressed with is that God answers. Remember, we said that it's easy for us to view the Old Testament as an angry God Old Testament, that God is just smiting them, that God is judging them, that there's wars and violence, and we could just see this part. Wow, you allowed them to be slaves to these people for 18 years? That's so harsh. Where's the grace? Where's the mercy? To me, this whole cycle shows us both the justice and the mercy. that God actually listens, and it uses human emotion to describe what motivates God. What does your translation say? What is God motivated by? Pity. Here we think of God as a God of love, but obviously pity comes from love. He pities them. He feels so bad that they're suffering, that they're in this place of oppression, that He'll raise up a judge. He'll raise up a judge, and that's what we call the salvation part. He'll raise up the judge, and so then the judge starts leading them. He gives them miraculous delivery. I mean, people start dying through all kinds of crazy ways through the judge's hand, like with bones and other weird instruments like tent pegs. Right? God takes the enemy out. And so then there's this period of what we call silence, or what the Bible will call rest. And then the land had rest from war for 40 years, for 15 years, for 10 years. And you think, oh, finally, Israel has learned its lesson. Right? Idolatry, bad. Worship God, good. They've got it. It's so clear. It starts all over again. And the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord said, hey, I rescued you last generation. This generation, sorry, not helping you. No, God doesn't say that. He doesn't say that in all these opening cycles. He keeps listening to the cries of His people, and He keeps raising up judge after judge after judge. And so, really, even though we call this book Judges, and we think of the judges as the heroes of the stories, they're really not. God is the hero of this story. God is the one who keeps listening to the cries of His people. He's the one who keeps raising up a Savior and delivering them, especially in light of the fact that they don't deserve it at all, out of grace and pity and love. So that's what really the book is then. The center of the book, or the main heart of the book, are 6 of these cycles that we run through. So in chapter 1 through 3:6, the author edits together an introduction. And in that introduction, he's basically saying what led up to the cycles. How did we go from Joshua generation and victory to cycles of sin and slavery? And we just read through his description. You can kind of read on through there, but it's really 2:11 through the end of that chapter describe those cycles pretty well. And in the beginning of chapter 3, he even says, and so he continued to leave some of the enemy in the land to test them, whether they would trust in God, whether they would follow in His footsteps. And what we basically find out is they fail. F-, right? Over and over and over again. They do not pass the test. Now, within these 6 cycles, this is where your handbook will say that there's actually 7 cycles. And I disagree with that. They're entitled to their wrong opinion. But it's not totally inductive. All right. So why don't I agree with them? Well, as we look at the cycles, the first cycle is the cycle of Othniel. And it's not a very long cycle. We're going to look at him a little bit later today when we look at the charismatic leaders that the judges were. But it really establishes the pattern, that pattern that we just read, of sin to slavery to supplication to salvation to silence, and then it'll start all over again. So we have Othniel, then we have Ehud, the left-handed judge. And all the left-handed people said, cool, right? Ehud, we got our lefty. Another short story, but again, the full cycle is there. And then we go to Deborah, and all the women of the Lord said, that's not a very womanly roar there, right? It's supposed to be some kind of like female power kind of thing, right? We'll do it again when we get to Deborah. Wow, you yell like a girl. All right. Cycle number 4. Okay, cycle number 4 is the cycle of Gideon. And when we get to Gideon's cycle, up to this point, the judges, even though there's unusual things about them, like they're left-handed or they're female, something that doesn't fit the stereotypical judge of their day, they still have victory. They deliver the people, there's rest, there's some peace. And there's nothing glaringly horrible about the judge themselves. Even if they're not perfect, they're overall good. And then when we get to Gideon and things start kind of shifting in the book, because Gideon fights his calling, he really doesn't want to do it. He keeps constantly asking God for signs. Then after he delivers the people, he almost gets into a civil war. Right? The tribe of Ephraim, those pesky Ephraimites in the book, come out and they're like, hey, you didn't call us out to go hit people in the head and kill them. What's up with that? Right? They really are just angry that they didn't get to go out and kill people. And so he avoids that civil war, but then he goes and he punishes the people who wouldn't help him. You're like, wait a minute, I thought you were delivering Israel, not going and beating them with thorn bushes and pulling their towers down. So Gideon, at the end of his life, the people come to him and they say, we want you to be our ruler. Now they don't use the word king here. They just said, we want you to rule over us. And Gideon's answer sounds righteous, doesn't it? He says, oh, no. The Lord is the one who rules over his people, not a humble servant like me. But instead, because I don't want to rule, I don't think that's appropriate, I got plan B. And plan B is give me all your earrings and your jewelry, right? We'll melt it down and we'll make it into a golden ephod. And everybody can worship it and it can rule over you. And you're like, wow, that just was really wrong. I mean, here's the guy who pulled down the altar to Baal, and one of his final acts in his life is to create an idol that becomes, it says, a snare or a trap to the people. Now, after he dies, it talks about one of his sons, right? Abimelech, right? Which means my father is king. That's what his name literally means. And in your book, in the handbook, it says that Abimelech is one of the cycles. However, there's no cycle with Abimelech. It doesn't talk about all the people turning away to idolatry. It doesn't say that God rose Abimelech up to power. Right? Abimelech just takes power. He kills his brothers, right? All other 68 of them. And then he goes and makes all these alliances with the city of Shechem, the lords of Shechem. So God has nothing to do with raising Abimelech up at all. And then there's no deliverance. There is no deliverance with Abimelech. In fact, there's just only death and destruction. He ends up attacking his own people and burning their cities to the ground. And then his glorious death is that he gets a huge stone that plops down on his head from a woman in a tower. And you look at Abimelech and you think, well, is he really a judge? No. Then why is that story in there? There's no deliverance. There's no sense that God's in the middle of that story at all. So why put that in basically the center of the book? I think to me, it's because it's the ultimate example of if you want to do things the nation's way, if you really want to see what it looks like, if you carry this motto out to do whatever is right in your own eyes, what can we expect in our society? You can expect more Abimelechs. Guys who are only out for their own power, their greed. He doesn't go out to deliver the people. He could care less about the people. He only cares about himself and his own power, his own fame. And then it shows you, again, there's no honor among thieves. He makes an alliance with the lords of Shechem, but then they're trying to stab him in the back, and so he has to come back and attack them. And it just is this horrible tale. But it's basically God saying, if you go down this route, if you want leaders like this, if you want to live this way, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get Abimelech. So Abimelech's not part of the cycle. It's really this hinge, this cruciality, this turning point in the book. Because after this, I ask you, what kind of guys are Jephthah and Samson? Good guys or bad guys? Would you want to be in a DTS that was led by Jephthah or Samson? Hey, let's just make it easy. If Andrew starts behaving like either of these two guys, right? You're not going to go, oh, well, I guess this is okay. It's just kind of a different way of living a life. No, we would be horrified. We'd want him arrested. We want him kicked out of YWAM. So this is what I mean. This hinge, this turning point, by the time we get to Jephthah and Samson, you're really trying to find something good in these guys. You're trying to find, okay, maybe this is a good example. Maybe this is a good part of the story. Let me give you a classic example with Samson. Complete scumbag. All right. Here's one story about Samson. Chapter 16. Someone read chapter 16, verses 1 through 3.
One day Samson went to the Philistine town of Gaza and spent the night with a prostitute. Word soon spread that Samson was there, so the men at Gaza gathered together and waited all night at the town gates. They kept quiet during the night, saying to themselves, "When the light of morning comes, we will kill him." But Samson stayed in bed only until midnight. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the town gate, including the 2 posts, and lifted them up, bar and all. He put them on his shoulders and carried them all the way to the top of the hill across from Hebron.
What's the point of this story? Why is this even in here? Where's the redeeming, timeless truth? I mean, I look at that story and I think, how random is this story? We're about to get into the Samson and Delilah story that most of us are aware of. And before that, it's talking about Samson's unfortunate first marriage didn't work out too well. And yet in the middle of these stories, we get this story. Where basically, and so Samson decided he was going to go and, find a prostitute. So he goes into a town and, does what he does with the prostitute. And the people want to kill him. And so he just uses his strength and lifts up the gates of the city and goes and dumps them on a hill. The end. Right, put this into our children's Bible. What a little picture are you going to draw? Are you going to draw Samson carrying the gates? Probably, because you don't want to draw the other part of the story. And I'm trying to explain to my kid, so what's a prostitute? Well, people are desperate for love, so sometimes they pay for it. Oh, well, and how are you going to explain this story? And I think it's so ludicrous that when I grew up in Sunday school, somehow Samson was a good guy. I really, honestly, if you'd asked me as a little kid growing up in VBS and in church and in Sunday school, I would have said Samson is a hero. He's the strong man. We make songs and we do hand motions, right? No! Samson is not a hero. He's a zero. He's a loser. He's a scumbag. There's nothing that he does that's good. In fact, what is the job of a judge but to deliver the people? Where's the deliverance at the end of Samson's life? It's not there. He ends up eyeball-less. That's his fate. He's a slave. He's a prisoner. They bring him out like a dancing monkey to entertain them. And so as Samson is there at the end of his life, what does he ask for? Does he say, "Oh, Lord, let me redeem my wasted gifts"? Right? "Oh, you gave me strength and gave me opportunities and I feel so bad because I blew it. Oh, I'm so sorry about the prostitute." Right? No. What does Samson say at the end of his life? Revenge! They've taken my eyeballs. No one takes my eyeballs and gets away with it. That's what he says. He doesn't care about his family. He doesn't care about Israel. He doesn't want deliverance. He just wants a dish best served cold. Revenge. He wants them to pay for taking his eyeballs. And so these cycles of sin, it's not just repetition. This is what I'm getting at. It's not just that the same thing keeps happening over and over and over again. It's that it's a cycle that's moving this way, like the swirling of a toilet when you flush it. That's where Israel is headed. Why? Why are they headed this direction? I can't hear.
They choose to do what's right in their own eyes.
They choose to do what's right in their own eyes. They don't want to follow God's holiness. They don't want to follow God's standards. They don't want to follow His plan for sex and marriage and government and every sphere that He gave them commandments about in the Pentateuch. They've got their own game plan, and this is where it takes them. As if we needed any more evidence about what happens when you live this kind of lifestyle, we get two lovely stories at the end of the book. So chapter 17 through 21, we have these final two stories. The Levite and the tribe of Dan, and a guy named Micah, and then we have the story of the Levite and his concubine. Now, as we look at these two stories, they are out of chronological order. The first story, talking about the Levite and Dan, it's speaking about when Dan hasn't even settled into its territory yet. So we're talking about just shortly around the time of Joshua's death. Because the allotments were given out, Dan receives its tribal allotment. It decides it's just too tough to take its allotment in the middle of the country, so they go up north to find a place that would just be easier than what God gave them. And so that's happening just shortly after Joshua's death. The second story, the Levite and the concubine, it mentions who the high priest is. And it says the high priest at the time is still Phinehas. Okay, so Phinehas is still the high priest. So anytime you look at this and you see what seems like a rather chronological order to the book, and then the last two stories are taken completely out of chronological order, we want to ask the question, why? Good. See, you guys are getting the inductive method. Very complicated. It's just asking why a lot. So when we ask that why question, what do you think? Why take these two stories and make them your climactic finish of the book of Judges?
They're examples.
Examples.
Two examples of moral.
All right, smarty pants, you're reading in your own words. Extending out a little bit.
In essence, warning.
Yeah, it's definitely a warning. Okay, what else? What do these two stories have in common other than moral depravity? Who is the main character in both stories? A Levite. Who are the Levites? They're supposed to be the religious leaders of the nation. And yet, what are they doing? Well, one of them's out looking for a job. He's like, man, I can't get a job. McDonald's not hiring anymore. I'm just going to have to go town to town, find a place to live. And so Micah, a guy who stole from his own mom. Dude, that's low. You steal from other people. You don't steal from your own mom. Steals from his own mom, and she's like, oh, it's okay. Just take it and build an idol. You know, so clearly there's some family dysfunction going on in Micah's family. So he builds an idol, and then the wandering Levite, right, stops in, and why not stop where there's some idols if you're a Levite? That's not a problem. And he's like, hey, I'll give you a job. You can be my priest. You can run my little temple here. And he's like, sweet. Money. A place to live. Then the Danites come through, right? Danites come through, and they're on their way to disobey God and not take their proper tribal allotment. And of course, they want to stop someplace, so of course you're going to stop where there's idols, so you can worship and do whatever you're going to do. And then they steal the idols, and they say to the Levite, hey, come with us. And you can oversee these idols for us, a whole tribe, because isn't it better to be the priest of a whole tribe than this little podunk backwater temple shrine that you're at? And he's like, yes, upward mobility, right? I'm climbing the corporate ladder here. And you're like, what? I don't even know where to start a list of what's wrong with this story. Like every single detail. It's almost like, can you find a story in which the Israelites break almost all 606 laws of the Pentateuch? I've got one. And it's just like, ching, 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 right? It just keeps going down the list. And just when we think it can't get any worse, we have the last story. The Levite and the concubine. The title of the story should tell us that something is amuck, right? Levites probably shouldn't have concubines. They should have one wife, and she should be an Israelite, and that's it. But this guy's got a concubine who it says is unfaithful to him. Shocker. Concubine's unfaithful, imagine that. And so she just takes off on him. And he goes and tracks her down. Oh, I love you, come back, right? And hangs out with the dad. The dad's not disturbed that his daughter has become a concubine to a Levite. That doesn't bother him. And he's just like, hey, stay and party. And then the next day he's hungover. Oh, I'm going home. No, come on, party another day. Levite starts throwing back shots, right? Day 3. Oh, man, I feel like I'm going to puke. I'm going home. No, dude, stay. We're going to party. It's going to be awesome. 5 days in a row, right? He's just partying with his sort of father-in-law. Like, I don't know what you call it when, what's the father of your concubine? Your concubine-in-law. I don't know what to call it. Anyway, and so finally he's like, dude, 5 days of partying, man, I don't even know what happened. Day 2, day 3, I'm out of here. So he packs up his concubine and everything and decides to go back home. They can't find any hospitality, and so they're sitting out in the square, and this old guy says, hey, come and stay with me. Right, so they go and stay with him, and lo and behold, later that night, right? It's not a vacuum cleaner salesman. It's not the Mormons. It's your local gang of drunk sodomites. Yay! All right? Who demand that this master of the house toss out this Levite so that they can have sex with him. I mean, so we really don't need to tell the rest of the story, do we? We can just stop at this point and realize that it's not just the fact that everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes. It's that the religious leadership that God had created, anointed, given a calling to, were complete and utter failures. They were the ones who were supposed to teach people the clean from the unclean. The high priest should have been the leader. Phineas should have handed it off to the next high priest and the next one. They were scattered throughout all the tribes. That's why they didn't get their own tribal allotment, so there would be Levites in every city, ensuring the holiness of God. And yet, what are the Levites doing? They have concubines, and they're selling themselves out for the highest price. So I think this is why these two stories are here at the end. It's not just examples of moral depravity. It's not just like you're like, wait a minute, what's worse? The fact that the Benjaminites did that and then they wiped them out, or the fact that then they told them to go and steal other people's daughters. I'm just not sure which one is worse. Is that what we're even supposed to do? No, it's the fact that God had this system in place. And what happens when religious leaders look exactly like the people? So, like I said when I started today, I wish that we could be called a Joshua generation in the West today. But when we think about these stories and how oddly familiar they sound to us, the reality is we're a Judges generation. But we can change that. And that is the great news about the cycles. Every time they cried out to the Lord responded. And every time God's people cry out to Him, He responds still today. If my people who are called by my name, right, cry out, intercede, I will heal them. I will come and heal their land. I will hear the cries of my people. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 7. It's a great speech by Solomon. And that timeless truth is why we do things like we do this morning. You spent this morning crying out to the Lord, interceding, saying, God, I know this world is messed up. I know it's not what it's supposed to do. We have done what is right in our own eyes. But God, please, would you rend the heavens and come down? Would you raise up deliverers? Would you raise us up? Not that there's something special about us. We're just left-handed bathroom stabbers like Ehud. But God, you can take us. And you can bring deliverance, and you can return the land to the peace and the rest of salvation by grace that it is supposed to have. And I believe that ultimately when they put this book together, that's what he was hoping for. Sorry, I'm missing a slide here. All right, so let's just do this real quick and then we'll take a break. Let's just talk about the dating. That's one of your questions. When did these events happen? What's the dating? The first event that is given to us in the book of Judges is the death of Joshua. You're like, die already! Holy cow! Again, 4 times it's telling us that Joshua is dead. Chapter 1 and chapter 2. We get it. Thank you, Joshua, for your service. As we said, that's about 1375 BC. So that's our starting date of the events of this particular book. Now, we don't have an exact ending date. All we have is that during the time when Samson is a judge, the Philistines have become the main enemy of Israel. And this is where it provides an overlap to the next book that you're going to read, which is 1 Samuel. And when we start 1 Samuel, Eli is the high priest, Samuel is being dedicated, and the Philistines are the main problem that the Israelites have. And God actually raises up Samuel as kind of prophet, priest, and the final judge. Samuel will be the last judge, and so Samuel and Judges really just interconnect. The story keeps flowing. You can't really separate them very easily. And so because the Philistines are the same threat, we think that Samuel's life is probably overlapping or close to Samson's life, somewhere around the same time period. And that would give us about 1100 BC. Now, Jephthah may know very little about the law of the Lord. That becomes clear as you study Jephthah's life and the vows that he makes. But he does seem to have a basic understanding of Israelite history. And in fact, when he's challenging the king's right, the enemy king's right, he goes on a little history lesson. And as part of that history lesson, and this is in chapter 11, okay, as part of that history lesson in chapter 11, he talks about how long have the people been in the land. And he says, look, we have been in the land for 300 years. And so for 300 years, why didn't you come and say, hey, we took your land? Why 300 years later are you suddenly like, hey, Israel took our land? And so that's in chapter 11, I think it's in verse 28. So that means that there's got to be at least 300 years of history covered from when the conquest happened in Joshua and Jephthah is a judge. So Jephthah, again, is one of these last judges. So we put all that together, and that means that it's somewhere around 1100 BC is the end of this book. Now, that creates a chronological problem, because if you add up all the numbers of years in the book, how many years a judge ruled, how many years there were oppressors, how many years that they were able to restore the land to peace, it comes out to just under 400 years. Okay, so if we just went from judge to judge to judge to judge, slavery, 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 rest, just add up all the years, it's too long. It wouldn't fit in here. It would mean that from the time of Joshua, the judge period wouldn't be finished until almost the time of Solomon. So that's just way too much overlap. So the way that we've solved this problem, and I don't say we, like I personally sat down and solved this, I mean in the Christian academics, the way that this problem has been solved is to say that these judges overlap. As you read through, you don't really see any of the judges being a leader of the whole nation of Israel. It's never that the case usually that all 12 tribes are united under a particular judge. In fact, they're all regional. So it usually says like, and these 4 tribes came up and they fought with Jephthah, and they went and they did battle in this one specific area against one specific enemy. So this whole time of the 300 years of the judges, there's civil war that happens, there's tribal disunity. There is no centralized government anymore. And so if we say that these almost 400 years are not consecutive, but some of the judges would have ruled at the same time, like say at the time that Samson was ruling, some of these smaller judges may have been ruling at the same time in a different part of the country, and only dealing with that local enemy and only gathering together those specific tribes. Does that make sense? And so I think that's probably the most likely way we can make sense of this. And because we have the 2 stories at the end that are out of chronological order, we see that our author can move things around if he chooses to. Chronology is not the most important thing. It's the message that he's trying to deliver. Right? Any questions on background? Yes?
You mean that's the ministry after the Samson?
What I mean is that they could be at the same time.